In another life, Tanya Compton lived in Ibiza. Footloose and fancy-free in her early 20s, she didn't go to the Balearics to look at gardens. But strangely, it was Ibiza which converted her from clubbing to cuttings, as she puts it, and that started her career as a writer and eventually a garden designer.
I have unwittingly changed a lot of people's engagement with nature, and I suppose that's more than I could have hoped for.
The influence of Ibiza's wildflowers can be seen in Tanya Compton's Wiltshire home. But a few miles away, she's been working on a grand, formal garden where others have trod the land before her and whose foundations have shaped her plans.
I knew that I had to do something that would work with the unbelievable Detmar Blow architecture that remained from this enormous house.
Tanya Compton believes in serendipity. Writing for House and Garden for many years, one of the houses she covered was Fonthill in Wiltshire. Much later, she bought a house nearby. And by this time, she was a well-known garden designer. The owner of Fonthill House, Lord Margadale, asked her to come over and advise him. It was the start of a long association, which continues, with an estate that has a fascinating history. Bought by Sir John Mervyn in the early 16th century, successive owners demolished houses and replaced them with the latest style in architecture. They included Fonthill Splendens, a neo-Palladian country house in the 18th century commissioned by William Beckford, Alderman of Billingsgate, twice Mayor of London. And a huge arts and crafts house in the early 20th century, designed by the architect Detmar Blow. So gigantic were the foundations of this house that they shaped the garden today. They survived the demolition of the house itself by John Morrison, a Conservative MP, first Baron Margadale, in favour of a modern house in the 1970s. Fonthill is all bound up with the Morrison family, a link which goes back to 1829 and its purchase by James Morrison, known as the Napoleon of shopkeepers. When Alistair Morrison, the current Baron Margadale, moved in 2005, he saw that the garden needed attention. So, when he commissioned Tanya Compton, was there a brief?
No. Well, there was a sort of brief. The brief was that the number of man-hours had to remain stable. I'm afraid we slightly changed that when the time came. It had to be actually very easy to maintain and look really good. I made my own brief, which was that the garden had to look really good from Alistair's bathroom, because he's got a very prominent vantage point over the garden, and from the drawing room. I also knew that I had to do something that would work with the unbelievable Detmar Blow architecture that remained from this enormous house that had been on the site where the 70s house is now. A lot of the garden was actually built on the foundations of what had been a vast house there called Little Ridge.
The alterations to the gardens at Fonthill started, as all designers will know, with a measured survey, the basis for Tanya Compton's design. Oh, and in her case, with paperweights.
Ah, yes, these are these magic tools for holding plans in place, which are seamstresses' fabric fasteners. And you put them down, and anything, especially with rolling, when you have big rolls and you're taking plans out and they want to roll back away or go back into a ball, you put those down and it keeps them separated. They look light, but they're heavy. And of course, my old paperweights that my grandmother would give me for Christmas every year, that now Jamie has in his office, but I use them to hold plans down. Everything you see as a line in grey on the plan is one of Detmar Blow's extraordinary Chilmark stone walls. These are buttresses that this is what scale, 1 to 200. This is what I call the Bastion wall. It's an extraordinary 5-metre high wall with these sort of, it's like a medieval castle buttress. And so that actually dictated the way that the garden was going to be laid out, because their structure is so strong and so perfect that I followed it to the letter. I'm not usually a garden of compartments type of girl, but I very much have Detmar Blow to thank for having influenced the infrastructure of this garden and the way that it lended itself to being divided up into what feel like rather regular units of space. But although they look it on plan, they don't so much feel it in situ, because what you're not seeing on plan is this extraordinary view and landscape that unfolds to your south.
Something else you can't read on the 2D plan is one of the greatest challenges for Tanya Compton. A change in level so great that there's a drop of 25 metres between the entrance courtyard and the south garden. All that was to come. First, there was repair work to be done at the front of the house and a new approach, on plan and on the ground, to give visitors the right impression as they arrive at Fonthill and enter the courtyard.
The entrance courtyard, I felt, and actually do still feel, would benefit from some trees to give a slight volume of greenery, because it's still very stone heavy, and it's flanked by these enormous stone arches that we've covered with wisteria. And wisteria now goes up these walls here, and it looks beautiful. Then leading you into the courtyard is down this very narrow alley that had a sort of assorted old pyrocanthus in it. So we've made this very formal and brought in some clipped Quercus ilex. There are 2 wonderful Persian ironwoods at the ends here, and their scale was so monumental that I felt it needed a bit of balancing, so we've put some multi-stemmed parottias in here also to give this incredible autumn colour. This garden is designed to be very, very good in autumn because the house is used a lot during the shooting season. You look at the plan and you think, my goodness, that's sort of so repetitive in shape, but actually all these gardens have very much got their own independent atmosphere. I can see this as a ready-made garden when I'm designing. I'm sure that this is the same that everyone says. The trick is to convey that to the client.
A perfectly crafted production. Sky Arts, proudly sponsored by Lexus.
Ja, det skulle jeg så hjælpe.
Hello, Edinburgh! Is my fringe okay?
Whatever you find funny, find more funny on TikTok, the official virtual stage of The Fringe.
Ice skating is my passion, my great love. Whether I have my period or not, I feel free to move as I want to.
Try Always Platinum with its new Comfort Lock wings. It is designed for protection with up to 0 leaks, 0 odor, and 0 bunching with 0 feel system.
On the ice, I feel free. Nothing and no one can limit my movements.
Always Platinum, rewrite the rules.
Wow, guys, someone's out there very important.
The princess has been the best thing to happen to the monarchy in centuries.
She's been pushed from the word go.
What's wrong with us as a country? Should this mean so much to us?
She's very close to being a monster. That's ridiculous.
She has a sick mind.
She likes to be bloody well watched. It's the media causing the problems. Leave them alone.
Look, see the faces. The people in there. Look at them. Trapped.
A perfectly crafted production. Sky Arts, proudly sponsored by Lexus.
At Fonthill in Wiltshire, Lord Margadale understood what Tanya Compton was driving at with her design for his garden, but decided that it would have to be done in stages. It's a facet of most British garden designers' lives that they remain involved with their projects, either because, like Fonthill, the development is phased, or because a completed garden needs almost constant attention and refinement as trees and plants grow.
So with the pruning of the Philadelphus, and if you take it down to about that much from the top of the wall, it'll grow back into a big wide hedge very quickly.
And there are other challenges. At Fonthill, it was the soil, different types across the estate.
There's this wonderful band of greensand up above the house where Alistair's grandmother had planted a wonderful collection of rhododendrons and azaleas and camellias. But then the garden itself is on a sort of band of clay, and then the lower area is very free draining chalky soil, which I love. I mean, nothing gives me greater pleasure than having these 3 different habitats to play with. Mary Louise Aegis has done some planting in the Northwood, which is the big greensand belt. But there's still patches of wonderful greensand where we've added lots more cornices to the garden because they flourish there. I'd say that there are fewer, less formal areas at Fonthill. Alistair likes quite sharp lines, and he likes things to look very tidy. So we haven't done much wild gardening at Fonthill. There's one bank that I dream of becoming a primrose and cowslip bank, but unfortunately leaving grasses, Alistair has very bad hay fever, so we've managed to get it to a very early spring bulb.
How did Tanya Compton, gardening from the age of 4, Lady Tanya Compton because she's the daughter of the 7th Earl and Countess of Clanwilliam, come to garden design? Not through university or any landscape design course, as you might expect, but through a visit to France.
I went to Paris. I'd actually had a wonderful French exchange, and I thought everybody in Paris had liveried footmen bringing pomme allumette to the table every day. So I hot-footed off to Paris when I was 18. I had a boyfriend who lived in Ibiza, and his ex-girlfriend moved in, so I decided it was time to leave Paris sharpishly and move to Ibiza, and actually ended up living there for 2 years. I wasn't working. I was cooking and reading gardening books, and it was there that I read the Victoria Glendinning biography of Vita Sackville-West and thought, oh my God, gardening is actually something people do. It isn't something that just happens. And that was a very wonderful light bulb moment. But actually walking in Ibiza and the smells and these incredible meadows that would erupt after winter rain, I felt the desire to suddenly start growing. So I bought my first packet of seeds, which was the blue Ipomea that you see covering every dump all over the Mediterranean, the one with the dark blue flowers. And I couldn't understand how lucky I was when it germinated after 3 days. And I smothered a poor olive tree in this beautiful Ipomea.
In Spain, Tanya Compton came close to setting up a branch of Culpeper, a herbal business which had been started in London in 1927 by Hilda Lyle, who single-handedly revived Britain's interest in herbs and herbalism and edited Maud Greaves' book, A Modern Herbal. The Spanish franchise idea didn't work, but some good came out of the preparation, a deep understanding of plants that's underpinned Tanya's career as a garden designer.
Because of my grandmother being president of the Society of Herbalists, which is now the Herb Society, and she was a great friend of Mrs. Lyle, who'd written an incredible A Modern Herbal. I had holiday jobs in Culpeper, which was a shop in Bruton Street. From the age of 14, quite extraordinarily, I was employed, and doing the stock on all these packets, and old ladies would come in to buy their packets of orris root for making potpourri, or herbalists would come in to buy dried alderbark or cinchona for malaria. And so actually I was absorbing all this information about the use of herbs in a medicinal sense. I understood what L. Dot meant after a herb's name. Of course, now I'm married to Jamie, a taxonomist. The Linnaean links are very important. But it did actually give me this grounding, not just in the uses, but the naming, the history. It's an extraordinary book, A Modern Herbal.
That introduction to plants was invaluable when she was taken under the wing of the garden designer and plantswoman Penelope Hobhouse in the summer of 1988. A stint at the English Gardening School at the Chelsea Physic Garden followed, where she met her now husband James, who was then the head gardener. Then there was journalism. For 12 years, she was the garden editor of House and Garden, writing at first about plants, later about gardens. It gave her a unique view of the private gardens of England, the subject of one of her books.
I was in this unbelievably privileged position of going and visiting early work by Tom and Dan and Christopher Bradley Hole and all these incredible designers who were also at the sort of beginning-ish of their careers and following the gardens they did and travelling abroad. I'd go to France 3 times a year looking at French gardens, and I'd go to America. It was, Condé Nast in its heyday. So actually that all informed me incredibly. It was like being on a sort of 12-year PhD of garden design and what you love in a garden, and where too much design interferes with a garden and becomes a sort of block to one's desire to want to spend time in that space, and where letting go can actually be a much better way of inhabiting a space. What I think I've learnt most is that you really do need that balance between set piece and spontaneity.
In fact, Tanya Compton's style was altered by what she saw. Now, she recognises that spontaneity, reacting to what's around her on site, is a key part of her style.
I actually do fewer and fewer plans and do more and more designing in situ and relying on what comes in from Belgium on a trolley of topiary. I also find working at a drawing board, although I have to do it quite a lot, I will rip it all up quite a lot when I'm on site. Obviously, the structure of the garden I work out, but I find that I prefer pegging everything out myself and being very happy to change my mind and working with clients who understand that that's quite often how I'll work. And I think the tendency of a plan is to put shapes in that will look good on a piece of paper, but actually the tree planted where it looks good on a piece of paper is going to block the view of the church, and I'd rather see the church. So that's why actually I'd rather see the beautiful oak tree that's in the middle distance. I do more and more positioning in situ.
Planting plans like this one may be rarer now in Tanya Compton's work, but she continues to produce watercolours which somehow seem to go with the gardens on which she works. These are not for framing, they're working watercolours, as the notes on either side show. Architects talk about the language of their architecture. Can we say the same for garden designers? Tanya Compton thinks so, and she has a word that immediately springs to mind for hers.
I think the language is lusciousness. I really want people to want to be in their gardens, not just look at them and have them as an adjunct to their house. I have unwittingly changed a lot of people's engagement with nature, and that's more than I could have hoped for.
A perfectly crafted production. Sky Arts, proudly sponsored by Lexus.
The thing that's different about a Vrbo holiday home, you always have the whole place to yourself. No stranger at the dinner table making things awkward, or in another room taking up space. It's just you and your people. Because why would you ever share your holiday home with someone you wouldn't share your holiday with?
With other prices rising, wouldn't it be nice not to worry about your mobile bill? With Sky Mobile, you can get 2 gig of data for just £6 a month. That's the UK's cheapest annual data plan amongst big networks. And unlike most other networks, we won't raise our prices mid-contract. So get the UK's cheapest annual data plan amongst big networks, with 2 gig for only £6 a month and no price rises mid-contract. All on our award-winning network. Sky Mobile. Value you can believe in.
Here in Germany, we know you love your football. Taktik. Aufstellung. Gegenpressing. And we know you love noise. Leidenschaft. Chaos. Begeisterung. Ja! Door. And we know you love us really. The Bundesliga continues live on Sky Sports.
A perfectly crafted production. Sky Arts, proudly sponsored by Lexus.
When Tanya Compton and her family moved to Wiltshire, she knew she had a family connection. Her ancestors are buried in a nearby churchyard. Family matters here. The generations are remembered.
I think it's the greatest thing that any grandparent usually can pass down to their children, almost more than parents. I think of the people who you meet and talk to, they have this sort of atavistic memory of their grandparents' gardens. And sometimes it's their parents, but yeah, I think my grandmother's garden and way of being, she was a herbalist, and quite a sort of organic, ahead of her time character. I think summers spent in her house, where I remember oriental poppies, big banks, so that must have been early summer, and fruit cages. Yeah, it had an indelible impact on how I was going to spend my life.
She feels comfortable here, in a house which looks out to an ancient landscape and whose 6 acres were, when they bought it, being grazed by sheep.
I've done the garden here in a completely different way to any way I'd approach anywhere else. It was all fields, and there was an avenue of trees that concealed the view, so I'm afraid we took the trees down and took the tarmac up, and behind the tarmac was fencing. This was all used by the local sheep farmer, who was very disappointed when I said, the fences are all coming down and I'm going to make a garden here. And he said to me, you'll never make a garden on that clay. So that was red rag to my bull.
Tanya wanted lawns near the house to meld into meadows, and meadows into ponds, and the whole plot to blend into the land beyond. She was already a designer, but there was no drawn plan for her own home. It was all in her head. She knew that she wanted what she later described as an abundance in summer, sharp lines in winter.
First of all, I've chosen a lot of trees that have a naturally self-pruning shape, like Carpinus Franz-Fontaine, which is actually getting a little bit too big for its boots at the moment. And lots of different hornbeams that like our heavy clay. Globus, which is a wonderful sort of pear-shaped dwarf form of hornbeam. Then bits of yew, not too much yew, because this is essentially a farmhouse garden and it's not a grand garden, but just those pinpoints of that dark matte yew. and the odd shape in the meadow so that the meadow has elements of garden rather than just wild landscape.
Then Tanya Compton was seized by the idea that even in this Wiltshire clay, it might just be possible to bring into the garden a bit of the Mediterranean.
I don't know what came over me to think that I could make a Mediterranean garden in a north-facing courtyard on heavy clay, having just taken the tarmac away. But anyway, we filled it up with gravel and I tried it and it's worked really well. It's quite extraordinary. So it's got lots of Helichrysum italicum angustifolium, which is my absolutely favourite Mediterranean plant. It's called the curry plant and it gives off an amazing smell after rain. So that sort of greets us. And actually lavender didn't do well to begin with, but now it's doing really well, so there's lots more lavender going in.
Here, Tanya Compton is client and designer. The sort of formal arrangement she painted for Fonthill wouldn't work here, but the wild flowers meadows of Ibiza might. And in that, she was ahead of her time.
I did it in response to knowing that we had 6 acres, and it was partly a desire for wilderness. I was very influenced by Mirabel Osler's A Gentle Plea for Chaos, and of the gardens that I'd visited as a gardening editor for House and Garden, the ones that always spoke to my soul most were the wilder ones. It was a question of necessity. I knew we were never going to have more than a gardener one day a week, and that we had this big canvas. And I also instinctively knew that all the wonderful dragonflies and butterflies and bees that I'd loved in small doses in our last garden would flourish here, which they have. I more often than not come out with the intention of gardening. If I come out and start gardening, that's it, I'm lost. I'm gardening and I have to be yanked back in when it's dark. But I start every day with a walk around the garden and I end every day with a walk around the garden, and the walks take successively longer and longer time. So looking is what I do much more now, and wandering than gardening.
Wild it may mainly be, made without a drawn plan, but Tanya Compton's garden does have some formal elements, which hints at the irresistible urge of garden designers to, well, design.
They've been put in just as a sort of reminder that one's in a controlled space, which is actually a bit of a dichotomy, and the more I live in the space, the more I appreciate and the more I want to get rid of those spaces. So it's a really weird, the designer in me loves them, but they're not really necessary, but they do look good.
And when it was done, if a garden can ever be said to be done, just for the record, Tanya Compton produced a watercolour to show what went where.
A perfectly crafted production. Sky Arts, proudly sponsored by Lexus.
It clicked, as it felt smooth instantly.
It clicked, as I cared for my skin, my way, with every shave.
It clicked when I discovered the right blade for my skin. Make it click for you. Change the blades and keep the handle. Venus. My skin, my way.
New Lynx Epic Fresh Body Wash. Smell and feel irresistibly fresh.
A perfectly crafted production. Sky Arts, proudly sponsored by Lexus.
Tanya Compton feels her gardens in a way which is perhaps unusual. She's alive to the ghosts that come with ancient houses and their estates, to the outline of gardens which were there before but have all but disappeared, to the relationship between the garden and the landscape. She grew up visiting relatives in country houses such as Uppark and Burley on the Hill in Rutland. And thanks to her 12 years as a journalist, she's able to set them all, including Fonthill House, in context, the context of the English garden.
I think it's a mixture of climate and temperament and temperature. We spend a time engaging with nature in a way that the French should, in the manner of Rousseau, but they don't. Rousseau really should have been English. There's a collective psyche that knows that being outside is good for us and that we want to grow plants in this incredible climate we've been blessed with.
What would Alistair Margadale's ancestors say? They might wonder at the modern house, but they would surely recognise the gardens, and they would undoubtedly applaud the ongoing improvements to Tanya Compton's designs. Which leaves the views. For these, Tanya Compton has made subtle changes, but she sees an interesting link between the views and the remains of the Detmar Blow house, one of the many ghosts she came across at Fonthill.
We actually made more of the views. We took quite a lot of trees out. Because of the walls being so prominent, they're bastion walls. You feel you're in a safekeeping by a keep. It's a moated landscape without the water. You feel very safe with these amazing views, especially from the top of the garden on a winter's evening at sunset, looking across to Wing Green and seeing Wing Green bathed in pink, and then looking down to the lake. It's honestly one of the most beautiful places I can imagine.
There is a sense that the work at Fonthill is never-ending, that this English country house can never quite shake off the irresistible urge of its owners for change. From Sir John Mervyn in the 16th century to the Morrison family of today. Tanya Compton is the latest in a long line of designers who've touched the property. 15 years of her work, which has brought it into the 21st century. And it isn't over yet. The links between the many parts of her career, the waypoints we might call them, are not lost on Tanya Compton, all those round endings. Take Ibiza, for example, where we started. In Ibiza, her love of wildflowers was born. In Ibiza is one of her most recent commissions, which has allowed her to return to the Mediterranean.
I actually have gone back and done some work in Ibiza, and I'm now got a project in Greece that's very heavily informed by that Mediterranean space. And what I've learnt from Olivier Philippi, who's the incredible nurseryman who I get all my plants from for a Mediterranean project, is that a lot of the Mediterranean flora is allopathétique, which means that it's got these hormones that prevent things growing around them. So all the planting that has space, so you don't have everything in a profusion of cheek by jowl, is because they're giving off signals that they need their space. So on top of the lovely furry silvery leaves that I'm so keen on, you've got this other element of the plants speaking to each other, giving themselves each their space.
So Tanya Compton, even at this stage in her design career, continues to learn and to apply that learning. Her work evolves, and she's heavily influenced by those who've gone before. Not just the garden designers she admires, but also members of her family, like her grandmother, the herbalist, whose presence she feels in her own garden. But there is one coincidence which trumps them all. It happened while Tanya was laying out the new garden at Fonthill.
I was working with contractors widening the terrace below on the south lawn, and we were replanting that area. And my father came over to see me and said, "Darling, I'm reading Mummy's diaries, and did you know she met Daddy, my grandparents, on the terrace of the south lawn at Fonthill in 1904. I was like, I'm working there today. She was staying there, and my grandfather had been invited over for tea to meet my grandmother because they thought he'd be suitable. And that's where they met, and there was this beautiful, vivid description. Serendipity and small worlds.
Next time, Cleve West has won 6 gold medals at Chelsea, but his heart isn't in a show garden, it's in his allotment. He's a man who feels at one with nature encourages others to feel the same, and believes in the power of nature to heal. So, when he was asked to design a garden for patients in the spinal injuries unit of Salisbury's General Hospital, he didn't hesitate.
I've worked on an idea which drew upon the metaphor of the spine itself. You arrive at the hospital broken, but you leave the hospital, whether or not you're fixed physically or not, you leave the hospital in a much better place.
Here was a project which would challenge any garden designer. And if Cleve West thought Chelsea was demanding, creating a garden out of nothing, a garden that would help the healing of body and mind, was something else.
I've heard stories of people just bursting into tears when they go into the garden for the first time after spending like 4 or 6 months inside the ward. Now I really understand how everyone can benefit from gardens.